Afternoon, everybody. I want to thank everyone for being here. We are this afternoon announcing the legislative component of our Strong Ohio plan. The people of Dayton, in shock and grief after the tragedy in the Oregon District in August, asked leaders to do something. 48 hours after that shooting, I unveiled our Strong Ohio, a 17-point plan focused on protecting Ohioans and keeping Ohioans safe. Strong Ohio is a comprehensive approach to violence reduction, which is designed to do the following. 1, better help individuals who pose a danger to themselves and others, to get them help. 2, to enhance the safety of law enforcement and first responders. 3 is to protect Ohio families, and further to reduce violence in all of our communities in Ohio, many of which experience gun violence far too often. A number of the parts of our Strong Ohio plan were actions that my administration could do right away without legislative action. For example, we've expanded the Safer Ohio tip line to encourage Ohioans who see something to say something. That toll-free number is 844-SAFER-OH, 844-723-3764. Further, we established the Ohio School Safety Center to enhance safety resources to our schools. And we are implementing training programs in our schools to help identify potential threats of violence. Further, with the great help of the state legislature, our state budget is investing $675 million for wraparound services for Ohio school children, things such as mental health and social services. Next, we're increasing access to behavioral health services and risk factor screening tools across the state. And we are enhancing safety measures at nonprofits and religious organizations to make their facilities more secure. However, as I stated in August, a number of items in our Strong Ohio plan will need legislative action. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Since August, our administration has worked with legislators and many interested organizations, including many of the people in this room, to prepare the legislative language needed for these changes. Today, I'm pleased to announce that our Strong Ohio bill is ready to be introduced. And I want to thank State Senator Matt Dolan. Matt, thank you very, very much, who is going to be the bill's primary sponsor. Our Strong Ohio bill will create improved measures to protect the public by helping those who are a danger to themselves or to others, either due to severe mental health, drug, or alcohol disorders, and by developing a process to separate firearms from those individuals legally prohibited from possessing them. Our Strong Ohio bill will enhance the state and federal background check systems to ensure more thorough results and prevent those under a weapons disability from purchasing a firearm. Our Strong Ohio bill will increase the number of private sale background checks in Ohio while also protecting the rights of law-abiding gun owners. And our Strong Ohio bill will decrease gun violence overall by giving local authorities better tools to hold accountable that small number of people who are responsible for most gun-related crime. When I unveiled our Strong Ohio plan in August, I committed that any legislation must achieve these 3 goals. 1, it must be constitutional. It must respect both the Second Amendment and Ohioans' due process rights. 2, it must make a significant impact on the safety of all Ohioans and save lives. And 3, it must be able to pass in the General Assembly. The bill that will be introduced by Senator Dolan, this bill meets all 3 of these criteria. Over the past 2 months, we have met with legislators, Second Amendment groups, law enforcement, mayors, the behavioral health community, and many, many others to ensure our bill achieves these goals. We have listened and we've consulted. We have heard their concerns. We have listened to their points of view. And I believe that we have come up, frankly, with better legislation as a result. And again, I want to thank everyone who's here in attendance. Mayors, sheriffs, prosecutors, legislators, doctors, educators, and so many other community leaders. I want to thank them for their support and their work with us on our Strong Ohio plan. I want to thank John Husted, the Lieutenant Governor, who really did significant work on several key components of the bill to address safety and constitutional concerns, especially as they relate to our friends in the Second Amendment community and the Second Amendment itself. And so now I would like him to come forward and discuss some of the details in the bill that have been enhanced during the drafting stages. John?
Thanks, Governor. Thank you for your leadership. Let me start by reviewing a couple things. As outlined by the Governor, we had a mission that we were undertaking in drafting this proposal. It had to be constitutional to respect Second Amendment rights. It had to be able to pass the General Assembly, and it had to work. We repeat these items again. And what we are announcing today, as the Governor mentioned, it meets those standards. These proposals were drafted after hundreds of hours of consultation with mental and behavioral health professionals, hospital personnel, law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, and gun rights advocates. These proposals include their input and reflect the balancing act of incorporating their competing worldviews. I want to be crystal clear. Everything we are doing places no new restrictions or limitations on a law-abiding citizen to own a gun. These proposals are focused on keeping guns out of the hands of people who, based on current law, are prevented from owning a gun. During the campaign last year, Governor DeWine expressed support for a red flag law if it could be crafted in a way that protected people's due process rights. After taking office, we began having conversations to see how such a law could be crafted. Following the Dayton shooting on August the 4th, the Governor and I announced where we were in those discussions. The conversation at the time was to draft a red flag law that included due process, whereby a person would have the right to defend themselves in court before they lost their ability to possess a firearm. This proved to be inadequate and unworkable for 2 main reasons. 1, a valid due process period would take at least 72 hours, which created a potential danger in itself during that 72-hour period. It also ultimately created a danger for law enforcement officials by giving advance notice to a potentially violent person that they were coming. The other inadequacy of a red flag law is that just removing the gun does not mean you've helped the person or kept others safe. As we know, there are many other ways to harm yourself or others than with a gun. An adequate approach must focus on the person, not just a gun. For these reasons, we are not proposing a red flag law. But we didn't quit on the idea that we needed a better answer, and we have that better answer. In nearly every meeting we had, internally and externally, I asked people to help us solve this problem. A mother has an adult son, which she loves very much. But lately, he's been acting erratic. He lost his job, he seems angry one moment and depressed the next. He's been buying guns and stocking up on ammunition, and she suspects he's abusing drugs and alcohol too. But he's committed no crime. She's grown very worried that he's going to harm himself or someone else, and she needs help. I ask, how do we help her? How do we help this mother help her son? The result of these conversations is the enhanced safety protection order. The foundation for the safety protection order is built on the existing pink slip law, and it looks to remedy the inadequacies of that law. Let me explain by sharing the following diagram that you see right over here. Under current law, a person displaying a concerning behavior who leads law enforcement to believe that they may cause harm to themselves or others can be what they call pink slipped. This means that they receive immediate assessment by a mental health experts in a psychiatric facility, which is this part here. The individual, family member, someone contacts law enforcement, they're pink slipped, and they are brought to the hospital. If the person is found not to be a danger to themselves or others, they are released and sent on their way. If they are believed to be a danger to themselves or others, due to mental illness, their doctor can petition the probate court for court-ordered treatment. Under the current law, this would also prohibit them from owning or purchasing a firearm. Many in the gun rights and law enforcement, mental and behavioral health community have suggested to us that we use this current pink slip law as the basis for our safety protection orders, which is exactly what we're announcing today. However, there are two shortcomings in the law that need to be improved. First, the current law only allows a person to be pink slipped if they are believed to be a danger to themselves or others due to a mental illness, and does not include a scenario where the potentially dangerous person is suffering from a drug or alcohol addiction, which makes them potentially violent. And by the way, you're not allowed to own a gun under those circumstances in Ohio today under present law. Our Ohio Strong Plan proposes this be corrected so a pink slip can be issued under either scenario right here. Today, it's just mental health. We will be adding drug dependency and chronic alcoholism to the list. Under the current law, a person who goes through the entire pink slip process and is deemed by the court to be a danger under a disability, as it's termed, they are ordered into treatment and they are told they can no longer possess or purchase a weapon. However, the current law does not require the person to dispossess those weapons, even though it is illegal for them to possess a weapon. We simply propose the completion of this process by requiring the individual to sell or turn the weapons over to a trusted family member, and if not, then law enforcement would be authorized to collect the weapons until the individual has his or her legal right to own a firearm restored. This is just common sense. If you are a criminal or a person who legally cannot own a gun, we already know you and we know you have a gun, then it's irresponsible to knowingly allow you to violate the law. That's the second piece here. If you're deemed under a disability by the probate court, you could voluntarily sell your firearms, transfer them to a family member, or allow the police to collect them. We make two changes here and here that will keep people safe. Now let me move to background checks. Universal background checks are already required for federally licensed sales. However, there is no system in place to help with background checks in private sales, and we are going to build one to make private background checks easier. Let me be clear, we are not proposing a universal background check for private gun sales. What we are proposing is an easy way for buyers to prove they are legally allowed to own a gun and to give private sellers peace of mind and a responsible way to sell a gun to someone who they may not know. This part of our proposal is known as the Seller Protection Certificate. As the governor already mentioned, Innovate Ohio is working with the Department of Public Safety and the Department of Administrative Services to design a technology solution to fix our current background check system. This is important because a background check is only as effective as the information in the system. The RFP will be drafted by November, and we will begin the implementation solution by mid-January. What I want to express is this sincere thought. Law-abiding gun owners should never want to sell a gun to a person who, by law, is prohibited from owning a gun, especially those with violent criminal backgrounds. And unless you personally know the individual, how else can you determine if the person you are selling the gun to was not violent or a criminal offender? Law-abiding Second Amendment supporters do not want dangerous people or criminals to own guns. They certainly shouldn't want to be the person that sold it to them. This is why, under the Strong Ohio Plan, we create the security of the Seller's Protection Certificate. The Seller Protection Certificate is an easy way for gun owners to have confidence that they are not selling to a person who is legally prohibited from owning a gun. Here's how it works. A potential buyer can go to the sheriff's office and request a background check. Sheriff's office would conduct that check instantaneously through the Ohio Department of Public Safety. If the check comes back clean, the sheriff will issue a person a Seller's Protection Certificate, which they can present to any private seller as proof that they have passed a background check and are legally permitted to own a gun. A valid concealed carry permit will also serve as proof. The Seller's Protection Certificate would be good for 90 days and specifically give private sellers peace of mind that they are passing a gun off to a person who is legally allowed to possess it. Under this plan, private sellers won't have to require the Seller's Protection Certificate, but they will have an incentive to require one, because if they have a Seller's Protection Certificate, they will always be able to prove that they conducted a legal sale and that they did everything they could to ensure that they were selling to a person permitted to have a firearm under law. This system allows a person to sell a gun to a trusted family member or friend, but there will be an incentive to use the Seller's Protection Certificate when selling to a stranger. Under the old system, the seller could very reasonably say, "I didn't know he was a bad guy." But because we had not given the private seller a real pathway for making certain that their buyer was legally permitted to own a gun. Under this plan, the excuse of "I didn't know he was a bad guy" will no longer work in the state of Ohio. We are making it easy for private sellers to act responsibly and have peace of mind. We create a solution, an incentive, and a consequence. We make it easy for the seller to know if a person is allowed to own a gun. While not mandatory, the consequence of up to 3 years in prison for selling a gun to a criminal is an incentive to do your due diligence. We are giving private sellers the tools to know they are doing the right thing, and for those who knowingly do the wrong thing, there will be a real enforceable consequence. In conclusion, on these two very important elements of our plan, they do not infringe on Second Amendment rights or anyone who has a legal right to own a gun. What the plan does is put dangerous people, criminals, on notice that if you're a threat to yourself or others, you are not legally allowed to possess weapons, and we're going to build a system to ensure that you don't. Governor, thank you.
John. Let me now introduce Matt Dolan, who's the sponsor of this bill. And again, Matt, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you, Governor. Good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank the Governor and Lieutenant Governor for their leadership on this issue. I would note that this process began before the horrible tragedy in Dayton. So gun safety has been on the minds of the administration from the beginning of his administration. So the question for me is, can we all gather again in a few months for a signing of Strong Ohio? Well, this is what I know about the legislature. We come to Columbus with a diverse ideas diverse thoughts, and a diverse approach to this issue. But I am also extremely comfortable that we are unified in our results. And the results is a safe Ohio, that people feel safe in their schools and at places of gathering and in their streets. A healthy Ohio, that a person who is suffering from mental illness, addiction, has the ability to get help. And an Ohio that protects our basic rights, our right of due process and our right, our Second Amendment right to own a gun. I believe Strong Ohio accomplishes all three of our unified goals. But Strong Ohio will not be debated in a vacuum. The governor mentioned quickly in his remarks some of the items that we have done in the budget in dealing with mental health and providing for help throughout the state. There's also legislation that has previously passed, both in this legislature and in previous ones, that deal with gun safety, that deal with the ability for mental health patients to get help. But I will be working closely with my peers, Senator Gavarone, to make sure that we have beds available to treat folks with mental illness, with Senator Hoagland to make sure that our schools are indeed even safer than they are now by working with his bill on school safety. That in the combination of what we have done, what we are doing, and what we will continue to do, that Strong Ohio will be, at the end of the day, a bill that meets our goals. The goals laid out by the Lieutenant Governor, and the goals that I believe are a staple of the legislature: a safe Ohio, a healthy Ohio, and a protecting of our rights. I look forward to working on it.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you very much. Thanks, Matt. After I learned about the tragedy in Dayton, I texted the mayor, and she texted me right back, and not too long after that, Fran, I went over, and the mayor gave us a briefing. We went to the crime scene. I was with the mayor again that night. I want to thank Ann Whaley for the great job that she did during this tragedy. I want to thank her for her support of this bill, and frankly for her wise counsel in the preparation of this bill. Mayor, thank you. The mayor has her button on, so.
Thank you, Governor. I want to also thank the governor and lieutenant governor for including us and the Ohio Mayor's Alliance in this process. And I know fellow Mayor Tito Brown will be speaking soon, but I want to recognize some of the mayors that are with us here today. We have David Scheffler from Lancaster here in support, Mayor Warren Copeland of Springfield, and Mayor Dan Horrigan of Akron. There were others that couldn't make it on the short notice, but we are all united in the effort to work this bill. Do something. Do something. When we gathered for a vigil in Dayton the night after the Oregon district shooting, that is the cry the governor and I heard from the crowd. And I'm glad to be standing here with him today after he heard that call to do something. I've made it clear to Governor DeWine that I think there are things in the bill that could go a bit further, and I know this bill does not go far enough to end gun violence in our communities. But this is an important start. This is the first time in my career that I have witnessed our state government seriously consider restrictions on access to guns instead of allowing more dangerous weapons in our communities. The Strong Ohio plan creates incentives for additional background checks to occur. I hope we can get to a system of universal background checks, but this is a step. The safety protection order provision, paired with the existing pink slip process, could help keep people who pose a danger to themselves or others away from dangerous weapons at a very vulnerable time. Again, I am very glad to be standing here today, finally looking at progress in the right direction on gun reform. There is still much work to do. The governor, mayors like myself, and our state legislators are elected by the people to govern, not to score political points. Governing is difficult. Change can be slow. But I know that as with all things in Ohio, We are more likely to get there if leaders from both sides of the aisle are working together. Thank you, Governor and Lieutenant Governor, for your leadership.
Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor. Gun violence is not just a problem of mass shootings. Gun violence happens far too often every day in Ohio, including in our major cities and urban areas. And we read about this in the newspapers. Just this morning in Cleveland.com, I read an article about a young boy who was injured in a shooting. We also saw an example a few weeks ago. A young girl was killed. Both of these in drive-by shootings. In both cases, these victims were innocent victims. Great tragedy. I want to thank the mayors from across the state who support our efforts in the Strong Ohio Plan to address these issues as well, including Youngstown Mayor Tito Brown. The mayor and I have talked about these problems, certainly problems that are not unique to Youngstown, but that the mayor does see in Youngstown as well as in others, we see in other cities across the state. So, Mayor, thank you very much for being here, and I invite you to come up. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon to everyone. Mayors and police chiefs on the front line, we have a unique understanding of how gun violence impacts our communities. When there's a shooting, the chief and the mayor get all the calls. We see firsthand the devastating impacts that gun violence has on our residents. This plan is just one step, bringing much needed change to gun laws in Ohio. Mass shootings are horrific, tragedy, but violent crime happening every day across Ohio are tragedies too. Youngstown, Ohio, we've seen our share of gun violence. The Strong Ohio bill will decrease gun violence overall by giving local authorities better tools to hold accountable the small number of people who are typically responsible for gun-related crimes. We know who they are. We just need help to deal with them. Overall, most street-level gun violence in Ohio is committed with handguns that are typically stolen or illegally obtained by criminals who do not have the right to legally possess firearms. Local judges, law enforcement officers who interact with criminal offenders every day know who's responsible for the majority of the crime, and they know which subjects are most likely to be a violent reoffender. While increased penalties and discretion for violent repeat offenders can help communities become safe and reduce gun violence, our laws must be on crime, not just tough. It must be about the crime, not just being tough. This is why we want to make sure the discretionary penalties must be limited to either previous violent felony or new violent offenses with previous felony. The Strong Ohio bill will address violence by giving local judges more discretion to impose longer sentences when it is likely that offenders will commit violent crimes after leaving custody. I see it too much. The same shooter, the same criminal, over and over in our community. By giving local judges the power to keep most dangerous offenders in prisons longer will undoubtedly save lives of the people who would otherwise be killed. As mayor, I often say, no matter where you live in Youngstown, Ohio, you should feel safe. And Governor, thank you for doing so.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm extremely grateful that Whitney Austin is joining us this afternoon to express her support for the legislation. Whitney is a survivor of the Fifth Third shooting last year in Cincinnati. She's a responsible gun owner, is dedicated to making sure that no one else has to endure what she has endured. Whitney, thank you very much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the governor and the lieutenant governor for giving me the opportunity to speak today. For those of you unfamiliar with my story, I am a gun violence survivor. On September 12th, 2018, I walked into a mass shooting at my place of employment in Cincinnati. It takes my breath away nearly every time I think about this. I was shot 12 times, and not once did a bullet hit a major organ or artery. It is inconceivable. Yet here I stand, physically and mentally strong enough to be here to talk to you. So what do you do when you cannot make sense of the gift that you've been given? For me, there has always been only one answer, and that is to fight to ensure that I save as many others from senseless gun violence as possible. I will never forget the first weekend in August of 2019. It was nearly 1 year after the shooting that changed my life. I was on vacation in Florida with my family trying to unplug, and the text messages came flooding in regarding the El Paso mass shooting. I ignored them. You see, I have to. That's one of my coping mechanisms for remaining mentally strong. But the next morning, I could no longer ignore the many new text messages, because this time it was Dayton. It was too close to home. I lost it. I was overcome with emotion, with tears, with fear for my friends that live in Dayton, and for hopelessness, because these shootings are happening with far too much frequency. But it didn't take long for my resolve and my strength to return. One particularly inspiring moment, seeing and hearing the citizens of Dayton chanting, "Do something, do something, do something." And from the very location of the horrific shooting just hours earlier. You see, it takes many courageous and diverse voices to do something, and that is why we are all here today. Through the nonprofit that I started with my husband, Whitney Strong, we believe that lives can be saved from gun violence by advocating and executing responsible gun ownership. We also believe that there is an important role for gun owners, such as ourselves, to speak out in favor of reasonable solutions that seek to balance public safety and our right to bear arms. And this legislation does just that. It is a first step that proposes much-needed reasonable changes that will help curb the nation's gun violence epidemic. Look at this stage. Look at all of these people. This is an inspirational moment, and not just because I am a gun violence survivor. This bipartisan coalition of gun owners and non-gun owners have agreed upon a path forward for saving lives. I want to speak directly to the citizens of Ohio and to the legislators of Ohio. Let us not lose the momentum from this inspirational moment. You and you alone have the power to do something, so do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the critical functions of government, in fact, the most important function of government, is ensuring the safety of its citizens. This bill and all the Strong Ohio Plan really will make an impact on the safety of Ohioans. It will save lives. And I think it shows that together, working together, we will do something. We will do something that makes a difference. As Robert Kennedy said, and I quote, "What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence or lawlessness, but rather love and wisdom and compassion towards one another, and a feeling of justice towards those who still suffer within our country." And it's with that spirit that we move ahead and present this to the state legislature. We'll be happy to respond. Anybody who's spoken will be happy to respond.
Governor, in the days days following the August 4th shooting in Dayton, you said, "I'm asking the General Assembly to pass a law that requires background checks for all firearm sales in the state of Ohio, with exceptions of gifts between family members and other limited uses." Why change? Why walk it back from what you said?
Well, we think what we've come up with, frankly, has a lot better chance of passing, but we also, just as important in that, we think it will get the job done. We have increased, we have changed the standard to lower the standard, actually, to negligence. And so, again, the thing I would point out is that someone who transfers that gun to someone who is not supposed to have a gun is susceptible to a serious penalty under Ohio law. We increase that penalty, and we make it a tougher, frankly, a lower burden that the prosecutor has to prove. So those two changes should tell everyone in the state, if you're going to transfer a gun and you don't know that person, and you're not sure whether or not they can have a gun, you darn well better make sure that you demand that a background check be done, that they present you with that certificate, or if they present you with a certificate that shows they have a concealed carry permit. So we think it's very effective. We think for the first time, frankly, it is going to really get people's attention about these type sales. And so we think it's going to work, and will work exceedingly well.
Language matters, and optics matter, and the way people perceive things. Lieutenant used to talk about this, not a red flag law, and the background checks being the way you just described them. Are you concerned that the public will have a somewhat difficult time grasping some of these things? They seem pretty intricately designed, if you will, for better or worse.
Well, that's a good question. We are about results. So a lot of the people you see behind us, we consulted. And we tried to figure out, let's take, for example, what some people call red flag, but whatever you call it, the scenario that John described is what we worry about. I can tell you case after case that I've dealt with, either as a prosecutor or as lieutenant governor or later as the attorney general, that were just very, very sad cases where a police officer ended up getting killed, or the person who was having trouble and the parents called on their son, and then the son ended up getting killed. So what we try to do is figure out, how do you deal with that situation where the person has not broken a law, but where everybody looks up and says, oh my God, you know, this guy's a ticking time bomb. He's going to hurt himself, and or he's going to hurt somebody else. And so we went through this whole thought process of how to do it, and finally came up with taking the current law, what's referred to as the pink slip law, but drilling down and looking at that and saying, why didn't it work as well as it should today? Looking at it from the point of view of, how do we make it actually effectively work? And the goals that we had in mind, we think we've accomplished. So the goals are, one, we need to deal with people not only who have a mental health problem, we need to deal with people who are chronic alcoholic, we need to deal with someone who's a drug addict. So we added those two to the pink slip law. But we also provided, you know, direct help for that individual. And an advantage this one has over what, frankly, we talked about 2 months ago. And I just say we have learned. I think it's better. But one of the things that this does is it does not require the police to go in and try to get the guns away from an individual. It first separates that individual and then allows the police to come in much, much safer. You know, you talk to any police officer behind me, you want to go in and somebody who's got all these problems and they got guns, you try to take the gun away from them. This is not exactly, it's a recipe for disaster. So we think both of them have been improved. We think both of them will work exceedingly well. John, go ahead.
I would like to add that you're also, when we talk with law enforcement, this is the process they're accustomed to, okay? So this is what they're used to doing, but they pointed out to us the flaws in the current law, which with 2 additions we can fix. So we don't have to come up with some new process that may or may not work. We just fix the existing process, and I think that will be much easier for law enforcement to implement because they're accustomed to it.
We went into this with the attitude of, here's our 17 points. We think if we pass these, we're going to accomplish, with these 17, we can accomplish all the 3 things we talked about. But the more we talked about it and the more we listened, frankly, I think this is a much stronger bill. I think it's going to be a much more effective bill.
Governor, you mentioned that you want this to pass in the legislature. So have you heard any assurances from leadership in the House or the Senate?
Look, I have not asked for assurances because I think that would be unfair. I think that members have to take a look at this. They have to have the opportunity to have a discussion about it. But I'm confident that when they understand it and when they read it and when they discuss it, they're going to look at this and say, look, this makes sense. This is something we can pass. This is constitutional. This will make a difference. This will save lives. You will have some members of the General Assembly, as some of the mayors, who would like us to do more. This is something that we believe can pass, will pass, and will make a big difference.
Senator Bill, what conversations have you had with your colleagues, including President Obama, about this legislation?
So on this particular legislation, we've had no discussions yet. I've had the opportunity to read the bill. I don't believe any other legislators had that opportunity yet, so we will wait for the bill to be introduced and have a chance to read it. I am confident under Senator Obhoff this bill will get a full hearing. I will have every opportunity to work with my peers to make certain all the things that have been stated will be understood and that this bill can pass.
One criticism of the current pink slip system is maybe people don't stay for 72 hours. Were there any other changes made to improve that system?
John?
Well, the 2 provisions allow you to detain somebody for 72 hours. Added were drug addiction or chronic alcoholism, which healthcare officials told us and law enforcement officials say that oftentimes those are the things that would allow us to be able to do this. If you could just add them into the system, that way we'll have the opportunity to get them into the process, give them the due process day in court, and then if they are deemed to have a disability, then complete the process by allowing that person to either turn their guns over to someone else or have the police come possess them. So either way, the individual is going to get treatment, and we believe that in many cases, well, the reason that we did it this way, frankly, is that a red flag law does not require treatment. A red flag law doesn't mean that the person is going to get the support that they need to get better. There are many other ways than guns that they can harm themselves or others. This is a more comprehensive approach at helping to get them treatment and giving them due process before they would lose their Second Amendment, their ability to possess a gun under the law.
And could that be done through an ex parte process, or does this have to be in an open hearing with the accused?
It would be in the probate court. It would be in the probate court where the hearing would occur. You couldn't.
Would that be done through an ex parte process?
No.
Would that person be able to, not, pardon me for not following it earlier, would that person after getting treatment be able to get his or her weapons back?
That would be up to the court, but ultimately, if you earn your ability to possess guns under the law, then you'll have your ability to own a gun restored. But understand, the disability statute that we're talking about, we're not talking about changing that. We're talking about the same people today that are not allowed to own a gun under the law. That's what we're talking about. We want to make sure that we're enforcing that. The system has had some weaknesses to it, clearly. The piece where you bring a person in, you're not able to hold them, even though clearly they need help. That's what I was talking about with that mom. That's why we kept talking about, like, if a mom wants to try to help her son and save him or somebody else, we have to design a system as a society and a state to help her and to help that individual. And that's what this does. And I'm sure as the legislative process moves along, we'll get suggestions, and we'll be open to those suggestions, but based on healthcare officials and law enforcement, this is what they told us they need. And it doesn't violate anyone's due process rights or Second Amendment rights.
On the current pink slip law, when does the disability kick in insofar as possessing your own gun?
Under the current pink slip law, when does the disability kick in? Well, it would be when the individual is deemed by a court to be under a disability.
So that initial 72 hours has no effect on the gun ownership rights?
No, but the person could be detained for the 72 hours so that they are not separated from their weapons at that point in time.
How, 60% of gun deaths in America are suicides. Red flag laws, academic studies show that they do reduce the incidence of suicides.
This should do the same thing.
How?
This should do the same thing. It separates the person. First of all, you're separating the person. So we should have the same results. That's what we've seen when we looked at states, that you've seen suicide rates go down. We would think that would occur from this as well.
How do we deal with someone who is not drug dependent or is not a chronic alcoholic, that someone may feel like could be a threat? Maybe they said something or have written something down that would lead someone to be concerned that they would carry out some sort of mass shooting.
Well, you have current law that covers that. Andy, you want to come on up here, cover that? Andy Wilson, former county prosecuting attorney in Clark County, who has worked on this legislation. But there are current laws that, as you see from the newspaper, you see people who have made threats who have been charged.
If you break the law, you've broken the law.
Right. If under current law, if somebody is a danger to themselves or other because of threats of violence or attempted acts of violence, that actually allows them to be probated through the pink slip process. So we're actually just relying on what was already in the law to have that adjudication that then allows for the issuance of the safety protection order.
You mentioned consulting with Second Amendment groups. Have you gotten any feedback from them on this, or whether they're going to support or police or communities?
I think they'll be making their positions clear after they hear the news conference and get a chance to see the bill. But I can tell you this, that their voices were very much heard and very much incorporated. As I said in my remarks, there were a lot of competing worldviews about what the law should be, and we listened. Look, on the pink slip process and the red flag law, we listened to them. They said red flags don't work. It's not about the gun, it's about the person. Well, it is about the person. And there's more than one way the person can harm themselves or someone else beyond just a gun. And so we worked with them at helping to design something that accomplishes the goals of keeping people safe, but doesn't violate those due process rights. On the background checks, often one would say on private sales, you would hear the Second Amendment groups would say, well, why should I be prohibited from selling a gun to my buddy or my family member? You're not. But there is a consequence if you do sell a gun now to somebody who can't legally own one. I would always ask the question of them, why would we want to have a system where you could do that? We wouldn't. What law-abiding citizen would want you to sell a gun to somebody who's a criminal or somebody who's not allowed to own that? So they were involved in those conversations, and that led to the design of the tools we have today. And these will dramatically improve. As I said, there's a solution, there's an incentive, and there's a consequence to do the right thing. If you're selling a gun to your brother who you've known your whole life, there's no issue. But if you're selling to somebody that said, hey, I want to buy your gun on the internet, and you meet them in a mall parking lot, you ought to know who you're selling them to. If you're at a gun show and you don't have any idea whether or not this person is legally allowed to own a gun, you ought to make sure you've done your due diligence so that you are not a criminal by selling a gun to somebody who can't own one.
What would be the enforceable consequences? What would be the punishment for selling something to someone who's not allowed to have a gun? And if the person sees something that they believe is a legal certificate, is that a defense?
Well, that's why it'll be clear what the seller protection order is. So it's a valid concealed carry permit or a seller protection order that you get from the sheriff's office. So it will be, if you're selling a gun, you will know what the process is for looking at what somebody brings you to determine whether or not you've done your due diligence to make sure that the person that you're selling the gun to is legally allowed to own it. Look, criminals will sell guns to criminals, and there's nothing we can do to stop that. But we can create an incentive for you to do the right thing so that you're not guilty of a third-degree felony and up to 3 years in prison, which is the consequence.
What's the current penalty on selling a gun to a person I know?
Andy, what is it?
Did you say the current?
It's up to 18 months. And the standard is different. Right now, the standard is recklessly. Now we're making it negligent, which means essentially you ought to do your checking before you make this decision if you want to protect yourself.
If it's not mandatory, how would that, is the argument no longer valid to say I didn't know if it's not mandatory to get?
Look, we are increasing the penalty on current law. It's illegal to do that today. We are increasing the penalty, and we're taking, and I want to note this again, we're taking the standard down. It's reckless, down to negligent. So it's, again, this, if you're selling a gun to someone you don't know after this law passed, you're making not a good judgment unless you demand from them or unless you get a background check. We're putting some real incentives in the law to do the right thing.
If the protection orders and the voluntary seller protection certificate, if these pass, what's going to be the impact of this? Will this only involve like a couple of cases a year, or will this actually make a real impact and prevent like dozens of murders every year? Like what? Somewhere in between?
Look, I don't think anyone who's responsible would stand up here and tell you this is going to save X number of lives or it's going to reduce X number of murders. I'll go back to what I said at the beginning on the Tuesday after the tragedy in Dayton. I believe that every single part of this will save lives. I believe every single part of this will make us safer. And I think that is reason enough for us to do it.
Governor, we'll talk about the national landscape. You're in touch with other leaders elsewhere. Was there a similar appetite for this, do you think, especially in more conservative states?
Well, I think that what all the folks around here who've been involved in this, and there's been a lot of people involved, have come up with is something that's Ohio unique. I think after we pass this, you're going to have people in other states who have not been able to do things. We'll look to Ohio and say, look, in Ohio, this is what they were able to do. So I think this is a truly Ohio bill. I think there's been a lot of original thinking here, frankly, and I'm very proud of this work product.